few things in the book world that cause an uproar, quite like the two words banned books. Books educate us, they challenge us, entertain us, and sometimes they scare people enough to get banned. Across the US, books are being pulled from the shelves of schools and libraries at an incredible rate. And we're talking books about race, about identity, history, love. But the thing is, banning books doesn't just silence authors, it erases stories, very important stories that need to be told. It tells readers, especially young readers, that their experiences don't belong. Banning books means that children are banned from seeing their own experiences written out, experiences that maybe they can't see anywhere else. As a lesbian woman who spent her entire teenage years desperately searching for any representation in the books that I loved, I know firsthand how important that representation is. So to ban that, to ban children reading about anything considered to be out of the ordinary, sets a very dangerous precedent, because where does it end? So, today I'm going to be talking to you about the USA's top 6 most frequently challenged books of 2024. And this is not me saying that the USA is the only country, the only Western country to ban books, but there's definitely more data on it than anywhere else. Every year, the American Library Association, or the ALA, compiles a list of the top 10 most challenged books based on reports from the field and media coverage, and it's that list I'm going to be talking about in this video. Now, I was going to be talking about all top 10 of the most banned books in this video, but to be completely honest with you, I simply haven't had the time to read them all, and that would make for a very, very long video. So if you want to hear about the rest of the books in this list, I can always make a part 2. I'm doing the top 6 because I was going to do the top 5, and then I realised I'd already read number 6 on the list, so it just makes sense. So yeah, I've read all of the top 6, and today I'm going to tell you if I think they're worthy of the controversy, if they're worthy of being banned. Should children be reading these books? And I do want to remind you that children in this context consist of anyone up to the age of 18. I think it's very easy to think about 5-year-olds when we're talking about banned books, but we're not. Like, we're talking of children under the age of 18. But first, I want to take a moment to just talk to you about banned books. Like, what does that mean and what are the consequences of that? Like, how does a book get banned? Taken from the ALA website, the 2024 data on banned books shows that the majority of book censorship attempts, difficult, are originating from organised movements, is how that sentence was supposed to go. So we're talking pressure groups and government entities, including elected officials, board members and administrators, and they initiated 72% of demands to censor books in schools and public libraries. 16% of demands to censor books came from parents and 5% came from individual library users. And the most common justifications for censorship tended to be false claims of illegal obscenity for minors, horrifying things like books containing LGBTQ+ characters or themes, or simply covering topics of race, racism, equality and social justice. In 2024 alone, the ALA recorded attempts to remove 2,452 unique titles. Between 2001 and 2020, the annual average was just 273 titles. That is a massive jump. PEN America, one of America's largest non-profits dedicated to protecting free expression in literature, tracked more than 10,000 public school book bans in 2023 to 2024 alone. And the reason that their number is higher than the ALA's is because they track the books differently. So they basically include books that have been removed whilst awaiting review as a ban, because sometimes whilst these books are awaiting review, they're removed for months or years. But either way, whatever data you're following, these kinds of numbers haven't been seen since the Red Scare McCarthy era of the 1950s. So why is this happening so much now? Like, why are books being so banned? Like, what's happened since 2020? We all know, as everything often does, It all comes down to politics, of course. According to The Guardian, the beginning of this banning frenzy can be traced back to 2020 and the 1619 Project, which was a long-form journalism article which takes a critical look at the USA's history. This article focuses on the subjects of slavery and the founding of the country, and it essentially reframes the story which has been taught in American history classes for generations. And as you can imagine, this was wildly controversial. It received sort of praise and criticism from people all across the board, all across the political spectrum. But what the 1916 Project did was centre the narrative around the contributions of Black Americans in building the USA. And the project actually developed a whole educational curriculum to go alongside this article. And as you can imagine, Trump, who was president at the time, was not a fan of this. He said that this article taught students to hate their own country, and soon Republican lawmakers all across the country were scrambling to try and ban the work in all schools. And this was kind of the spark that lit the flame. Ever since then, right-wing politicians have focused an inordinate amount of time in their campaigns focusing on anti-American literature, how books can indoctrinate students into having progressive values. You know, those horrible progressive values like societal improvement, social justice, equality, the betterment of humanity. Gasp. Right-wing politicians started to get involved at the state level. They tried to support the people who were attempting to censor books in schools. And now, in 2025, 5 years on, we're seeing these efforts continue at a state level in higher numbers than ever before. And also, terrifyingly, a discussion of bans at federal levels as well, which basically means that instead of statewide bans, we're talking countrywide bans. And as I've mentioned before, these bans have an incredibly clear pattern of targeting authors of colour, women, and members of the LGBTQ+ community, which is very clearly mirrored in the top 6 most banned books I'm going to be telling you about in just a moment. Politicians are focusing on banning books that don't align with their political agendas, and Trump has called the book bans a hoax, denying that they're even happening. But there is very clear evidence that that is not the case. But you know what? Trump is not ever put off by truth. Books are being banned at the highest levels in decades, but of course Trump doesn't want to advertise that this is happening because book bans are very famously an early sign of authoritarianism and fascism. Book bans are a means of censorship. They're a way to control information, to suppress dissent and maintain power. If you can keep the public's understanding of history, of politics and social issues limited, you can control the narrative, you can control the people. You keep them stupid, you can control them. But often, especially in the more sort of right-leaning media, you won't see the book bans being referred to as what they are, as bans. Instead, you'll see it reported as a book needing to be removed from a library or withdrawn. It makes it more palatable, it's less scary that way. But how do these book bans work? Like, are these books banned entirely across states? No, that is not the case, at least not yet. Book bans often refer to books being removed from classrooms and school libraries. They refer to restricting children's access to literature. And again, I do want to stress here that children here refers to anyone up to the age of 18, up to high school. Casey Meehan from PEN America defined a book ban as any action taken against a book based on its content that leads to a previously accessible book being completely removed from availability for students, or where access to a book is restricted or diminished. Emily Drabinski, who is the president of the ALA, defined it as the removal of a title from a library because somebody considers it harmful or dangerous. So if these books are just being removed from schools or public libraries, you might think it's not that big a deal, you can just go out and buy the book. But Drabinski also makes a very important point in saying, I think sometimes our policymakers, many of the people who are active in the pro-censorship movement, don't fully appreciate or understand that many Americans, lots of them, don't have access to books in any other way except through their library, through their school or public or academic library. Books are very expensive, especially in the USA. I'm actually always shocked whenever I go out there and see how much one single paperback costs. For so many people, libraries or schools are the only way they're going to have access to books. So yeah, books being banned from these places, does have massive repercussions. Simply put, book bans mean that students have less access to diverse worldviews. They restrict their exposure to different perspectives, different ways that people experience the world. As Black authors, female authors, LGBTQ plus authors are stripped from the shelves, that means that certain students are seeing their own life experiences also stripped from the shelves, from the curriculum. And I say this all the time, but education is directly linked to empathy. It's not only the minority students who suffer from not being able to see themselves reflected in the literature that they're allowed to read, but also the rest of the students not seeing or learning about any life experiences that are different from their own. It's a really great way to just grow up in ignorance if you're reading about a very sanitized version of the world, if you're not seeing other experiences reflected back at you. Which I suppose brings us to the actual books. What books have been banned and what did I think of them? Why have they been banned? Are these too mature for a child audience? And the first one, the number one most banned book in the USA, is All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. I'm going to start by saying straight off the bat, I love this book, and I always feel a bit funny about rating memoirs because, like, who am I to judge somebody's story? But also, this is a book, so it can be rated on style and writing. And yeah, I gave this a really solid 4.5 stars. I really, really like this. In the foreword of this book, Johnson actually addresses the fact that this book is one of the most banned books in the USA, and I absolutely loved how they did it. So I'm actually going to read that to you right now. Guns aren't the only thing these people are lying to you about. They're not the only thing they're using to hurt you whilst claiming it's for your protection. They're also lying to you about books. Books are being banned across the country. This book, which you are currently reading, is the second most banned book in the United States as I write this. It is now number one. This book, which has never taken a life, never caused harm, a book that has helped build empathy, helped so many of you learn about the agency you have as young adults, the power you already have to change the world, your right to know the truth about the topics you live through on a daily basis that folks think are too heavy to discuss with you. They won't ban assault weapons to protect you, but they will ban books. And when they ban books, they are banning Black history. Ain't no American history without Black people. They're banning the portrayal of LGBTQIA+ people in history. Ain't no America without queer people. Oh, and they are banning abortions whilst also limiting sex education. They don't want you to have access to anything that even remotely teaches you about your bodies and how to protect yourselves. And honestly, I think that just pretty much sums up how I feel about book bans. End of video. That's it. We're done. No, I'm joking. This is a super powerful memoir, a YA memoir about what it is to be Black, to be queer, and to be Black and queer, and not have the words to express it, to express how that feels. Johnson shares their story in a series of personal essays where they share snippets of their childhood through their teenage years and their early adulthood. And Johnson keeps it raw and painfully, brutally honest the whole way through this. They don't shy away from talking about anything. This memoir covers so many important topics, from discovering your sexuality and the fear that comes alongside that, to internalized homophobia, repression, family dynamics. I can imagine that for a queer Black kid somewhere, this book could be somewhat of a lifeline, and it provides what the mainstream media refuses to, and that is representation. You follow Johnson as they work to untangle the toxic masculinity that society spent years drilling into them, but also as they begin to understand that they can be queer and masculine. They can still love sport and be friends with straight men and join a fraternity and be queer. Sexuality is not in a vacuum. You can be queer and be anything else that you want to be. Society puts so many people into boxes, and this is a story about breaking out of those boxes. And I think a world in which people aren't bound by the gender binary, a world where people are free to be whatever they want to be, is seen as very dangerous to a capitalistic, authoritarian society. Because those people are a lot harder to control, because people who know themselves, who are comfortable in their complexity, are so much harder to manipulate. They're more likely to question the wider systems, and that is seen as very dangerous. I would perhaps hazard a guess that that is why this book is so censored, and not for the other reasons that people tend to put forward when talking about this book. I will admit this book does cover some very heavy topics. Johnson talks about their experience being sexually assaulted by a family member. They talk about their first sexual experiences on their terms. But I don't think it's ever spoken about more explicitly than it needs to be to talk about these stories. Now, do I think that these topics, like sexual assault, are things that need to be explicitly discussed with children? No, maybe not explicitly, maybe. But according to Rain, 1 in 9 girls and 1 in 20 boys under the age of 18 experience sexual abuse or sexual assault. Just because we don't want to think about these things happening to our children, it doesn't mean they're not. And seeing memoirs like this with sexual abuse clearly written out, saying that this was wrong but it happened to me, could be just what some children need to read. And I know it is a really complicated topic because nobody wants to think about children in these scenarios, but it does happen. I remember as a tween, I must have been about 12 years old, I read a book, it's still one of my favourite books of all time, called A Swift Pure Cry by Siobhan Dowd. I actually read it as part of my book club at school, and it's about a girl called Shell. Her mum dies, her father falls into obsessive religion and alcohol, and Shell ends up finding herself pregnant and in the centre of a complete scandal in her very small, very religious Irish town. I remember learning a lot about life through reading that book, about a life that was thankfully entirely different from my own. I read that at 12 and I wasn't traumatised, but I think it just gave me empathy instead. And I think children should often be given a lot more credit than they are. I think had I read All Boys Aren't Blue at 12 years old, I would have experienced it in the same way that I experienced A Swift Pure Cry. Not trauma, just empathy. And also I think as a little queer kid who always knew she was different and didn't really know why, this book probably would have changed my life. I probably would have come out earlier than 25 years old. George M. Johnson doesn't shy away from telling their story, and in my eyes that is what a memoir should be. Sure, some of the storytelling does feel a bit flawed because he's telling the stories through the eyes of a child, and I felt them sort of like get more succinct as they moved through the years to adulthood. Johnson in this focuses so much on the intersection of being black and queer and what that means, all of the added complications that come along with that. I just feel like this story would help so many people challenge their assumptions of what blackness, of what queerness really means. And also the journeys that young queer people often have to go on to find their identities. Like, it's not always simple, even when it feels like it really should be. I just really, really loved this book. Banned book number 2 is Genderqueer by Maya Kababi. Now this is a book that I didn't enjoy as much as I did the last one, and I have to admit I'm not a graphic novel girly. I don't really get graphic novels. I'd much rather a story be told in words than through pictures, but that is very much a personal thing. So whilst I didn't love this and I do have my criticisms, I can still see the importance that this may have for so many people. Maya Kababi uses air pronouns, and this is their story of self-discovery and self-identity. You follow them through childhood and their teenage years as they come to realise that they are non-binary and asexual after being assigned female at birth. I must admit, writing this review has been a real challenge for me, a real learning curve when it comes to neopronouns, because it is so easy just to default to they, them, as that is what kind of feels neutral, but that's not what Maya uses. It was a real learning curve, a real challenge whilst writing this review, and if when I'm speaking out loud I accidentally use the wrong pronouns or use they instead of is that how it's pronounced? In my head that's how it's pronounced. Please know it's coming from a place of I'm really trying, but it's very easy to slip up, especially when you're just talking to a camera. As somebody myself who has never questioned their gender, this was really enlightening to me. It was so fascinating to see what sort of goes through somebody's head when having these questions about gender. Like, it's something that is so far away from my experience of the world. Like, I've never questioned my gender. I've always been so comfortable, so happy in my femininity. But I know what it's like to question sexuality. Like, I know questioning sexuality is a whole traumatizing thing in itself, but to question your gender as well is something that's so, like, gender is something that's so deeply ingrained in society that I can't even imagine how difficult it is to unpick everything that society teaches you about gender and what it means. I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling now, but it makes sense in my head. Anyway, something I really enjoyed about this book was the exploration of how arbitrary societal gender codes are, that actually the ideas of femininity and masculinity mean nothing apart from what we've being society, have all collectively decided they should mean. And Maya challenges these norms in a way that feels both deeply personal, but also universally resonant, universally true. E shows how liberating it can be to step outside of the binary and ask, who am I when I'm not fitting into these very pre-made boxes? And that questioning, that peeling back of all these layers is really powerful, even if, for me personally, the medium of graphic novel doesn't fully land. I still get and understand the story. This book is very honest, it's vulnerable, it's clearly written from a place of care and self-reflection. There are some real parts of this book that made me smile, like there's the first time that Maya went to a Queer Straight Alliance meeting at school and finally felt community for the first time. There's also a bit in this where a friend loans Maya some queer books and he becomes so obsessed that one day a best friend hands him a note reading, "Don't read any more gay romances, you get absolutely unbearable for days after." And honestly, relatable. Relatable for all of us, I'm so sure. This is highly personal. It does talk about Maya's first sexual experiences, and it could be argued that it's very graphic, and that is a lot of what you will see people up in arms about with this book online. However, I'm going to go out on a limb here and give a perspective that I actually haven't seen anywhere else online. I think if Maya's first sexual experiences were written out with a written description rather than the graphics, the drawings in this book, I don't think people would see them as half as sexual as they are. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I don't really know, but I do think the fact it's drawn out makes it a lot more confronting. But I think the general message around the sexual scenes in this was a very positive one. Sex is so confusing, especially when you first start having it, but especially for somebody who deals with so many questions about their gender. But as I said, I do have my criticisms. I feel like there were so many aspects of this book which were just so surface level, things which I was shocked weren't explored more. Maya was 11 years old in this book and unable to write. He was never taught about periods, about puberty, never given deodorant. There's at least a clear case of some level of bad parenting here that I spent the entire book waiting to be addressed, but it just kind of wasn't. And there was also another part of this book that really didn't sit well with me in regards to Maya's smear test or pap smear, whatever you want to call it. Obviously for a non-binary person like Maya, this can be a really tricky part of healthcare to navigate. But when you are assigned female at birth, when you have a vagina and a cervix, it's something you need to do for your own health. So Maya goes to the doctor and has a really tough time with the examination. And I'm not sure if it was because the smear was done wrong or just because it was a very uncomfortable time. But the way it's depicted here makes it seem terrifying and awful. And I just don't think that's something you should be depicting to other people who are very scared of things like that. There's no conclusion here. It was hard, but I did it for the sake of my own health and it was all fine in the end. It was very much I've been forced into doing this and everything about it was awful and there's no upside. And I don't know, it just didn't sit super well with me. And I feel like there are so many more delicate ways that part of this could have been handled. I'm very passionate about healthcare. I feel like smear tests are something which are so important for people with vaginas, and I'm worried that a lot of people will read this and get so scared that they won't ever go for theirs, and they save lives, so you should. I had a few problems with it. I can see why people would question this, not for any explicit reasons, but it does touch on a lot of the things that conservative people are terrified of. This does a really good job at breaking down societal gender expectations and why it's all just generally a bit ridiculous, and the patriarchy requires gender roles. So I can see why people are trying to challenge this. Do I think they should? Not really. I can see why. It's very, very blatant in what it's trying to do. It doesn't try and hide away. It doesn't try and say what it's saying in code. It just says what it wants to say, and that's scary to people. Banned book number 3, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. You guys, I love this book so much. I know Toni Morrison is a revered author, but I'd never read any of her work before, and now I just want to read everything. I'm also pretty sure this was her very first novel, so it feels like it was a really good place for me to start. And also this being a first novel, a debut novel. No, I can't. The Bluest Eye is set in the 1940s in a town called Lorain, Ohio, and it tells the story of an 11-year-old girl called Pecola Breedlove, who is desperate for her eyes to turn blue so she can be like all the pretty blue-eyed blonde-haired girls in town, aka white. Pecola is often regarded as the ugly girl around town that becomes her entire worth. Even her own parents refer to her as ugly, and she is constantly scapegoated by those around her. And so naturally she comes to have this real self-hatred. Like, she believes that she doesn't deserve any better than what she gets because of the way she looks. And so all she wants is those blue eyes so she can finally fit in. This book is a very deep reflection on race, racism, racial self-loathing, colorism, beauty and poverty, and it's a really hard read. Pecola Breedlove has a really hard life. Like, literally the opening line of this book is, "Quiet as it's kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941. We thought at the time that it was because Pecola was having her father's baby that the marigolds did not grow." You find out everything you need to know going into the story from that first line, and it remains really heavy from there. We find out Pecola's story, but also the stories of those around her, all of the stories from the past that led to hers, the generational trauma within marginalised groups, and that never-ending cycle that is difficult to get out of. This genuinely might have been one of the saddest books I've ever read. This book made me cry. And whilst this is Pecola's story, the parts of the novel about Pecola are actually told through the eyes of another girl in town called Claudia. So even in Pecola's own story, she doesn't have any agency. But Claudia is also completely innocent. She can't see things for what they truly are because she is a child. You're hearing about Pecola's trauma through the eyes of another 11-year-old girl, and everything is just tinged with this naivety. You see Claudia's life where she is protected and loved within her own home, directly compared to Pecola's, where she has none of that. And my first instinct upon reading this book was to say that I don't think this is a read for children, but I could also see it being analysed in a GCSE or A-level literature class. Morrison's writing is so beautiful, the way her sentences flow, the way she can seemingly make a metaphor out of anything. Like, the way she writes is so poetic, is so lyrical. The way she's able to explore the inner psyche of her characters is kind of unlike anything I've ever read. Sometimes I think that I can write a book, and then I read something like this and I'm like, no, I can't write a book, I can't do that. Like, how is anyone supposed to compete with writing like this? But I digress. Whilst this is a very difficult read, whilst it does depict sexual assault quite vividly, incest quite vividly, and it does make it a very hard read at points, I still think it's such an important story. Like, I don't know, it's really hard to judge books or judge whether or not these books should be banned or censored, because the idea is always spoken about as a monolith. Like, these books are banned for children, they're banned from school libraries. But age, I feel, plays a really big part in it here. You're not judging books suitable for a 7-year-old the same way you're judging books suitable for a 17-year-old. Like, any elementary school library isn't going to have this kind of literature anyway. They're going to have the children's fiction, the middle grade. A high school library, though, like, yeah, they probably would have this book, and they probably should have this book. I think this just really hits a sweet spot of being not too preachy, but so true, so honest about so many heavy real-life issues through the eyes of children, for the most part. In the afterwords here, Morrison writes that this is a terrible story about things one would rather not know anything about. But there's still true things. There's still things that happen to children everywhere, sadly, all the time. And so, shouldn't it be written about? Banned book number 4 is The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. This is a book that I actually did read as a teenager, so I feel like I can give you a really good insight into this one. I actually don't have the book to physically show you, and I'm baffled, because I definitely do have this book somewhere in the house. Like, I remember picking it up a couple of months ago when I was doing some book rejigging, some reorganising, and apparently I've reorganised it into the ether because she's gone. She is gone. What's going to happen is in about 2 days' time I'm going to look at this shelf and immediately see it, but I'm so sure it's not here. I don't know where it's gone. The Perks of Being a Wallflower is a coming-of-age novel told through a series of letters written by a teenager called Charlie to an unnamed person. He is just beginning his freshman year of high school, and he is a self-described wallflower. He is somebody who observes life rather than actively participates, and I remember that this book hit me so incredibly hard the first time I read it, because I felt like a wallflower too. Even now at 31 years old, I have to fight with myself to not be a wallflower. But anyway, as Charlie moves through high school, he eventually becomes friends with this group of older students, including Patrick and Sam. And they introduced him to the world of not being a wallflower anymore. They introduced him to parties and relationships and love and heartbreak. But Charlie also has some very deep-rooted childhood trauma that he's never quite worked through. And as he begins to connect with people for the very first time in his life, he finds himself struggling with his past, with that trauma. And the entire premise of this book is so deeply emotional. And I think the format of this book being letters just makes it that much more personal as well. Charlie is out here just spilling his heart to us as the readers. And I do think this book perfectly encapsulates what it is to be a wallflower who is so deeply desperate to make connection. The ALA says this one is most often challenged for many different reasons. It's claimed to be sexually explicit with depiction of sexual assault. They say it has depictions of drug use, profanity, and horrifically, depictions of LGBTQ+ content. Because we all know that reading about queer characters is going to make a child queer, obviously. It's actually how I'm gay. I read this book as a teenager and just became a lesbian. That's how it happened. I'm joking, obviously, but certain parents and school boards have claimed that this is very, very inappropriate for teenagers, because how dare they read about real life teenager things. And you know what, just like The Bluest Eye, I do think Perks has a lot of merit in actually being a book taught about in the school curriculum instead of just being banned. Like, there are so many deep topics in this book that are probably worth picking apart with an adult in a safe space, in a space that's going to give teenagers going through things like Charlie, dealing with mental illness, a voice, a chance to speak up, to know that they are seen and they are heard. Like, what's the point in hiding away troubles that are addressed in this book? I think this book addresses depression and anxiety in such a true and real way. I think it addresses the whole teenage experience in such a true and real way. Why hide away from that? I don't get it. I don't get it. Next up on my banned books list is Tricks by Ellen Hopkins. And you know what? This book should be banned. Not because of any reason other than the fact that I hated this. I hated the writing. I hated the characters. No, hated it. The fact that I even thought through this book and finished it is a miracle, because 3 weeks into reading this, and I was still only 38% of the way through. I read it on my Kindle again, that's why I don't have it to show you. In fact, this video was actually supposed to go up over a week ago, but I had to delay it because I couldn't finish this book. But you know what? That might be a very me problem, because I was shocked when I looked on Goodreads and saw that this has a 4.27 star rating. How? I don't know. This book wasn't for me, but I still wanted to finish it and give you my honest thoughts on this whole bad book thing, because clearly so many other people love it. Don't get it? You do you, boo. So, Tricks is the story of 5 teenagers from different parts of the USA who all lead wildly different lives. There are 3 girls, 2 guys, 4 of them are straight, 1 of the boys is gay, some of them are rich, some are poor, some come from families from lives of crime, for others that is a million miles away. But here are their stories, which slowly interweave to create one big, powerful story. This is a complete, no-holds-barred look into being a teenager, what self-discovery and exploration can be like for different people, and what happens when that goes wrong. I must admit, one of the main things I struggled with this book is the fact that I found all of the voices of all the teenagers so similar. So basically you switch between the point of views of each character like throughout this book. And although each chapter is headed with the name of the character that it's about, I find I'd get 10 pages in and then I'd forget the name and which character we're dealing with, so I'd have to go back and check, and let me tell you, that's a nightmare when you're reading on a Kindle that's about 8 years old and slow as fuck. And that drove me insane because all the voices sounded so similar, you couldn't tell who was who by just reading it. I found it really hard. Like, although the stories are really different for each character, the voices, the style of writing for each is so similar, and it's made even more difficult when each chapter is so short. Like, you're just beginning to get into a story and then it changes and then you're hearing about the next one. I found it like whiplash. I do wonder if maybe I should have listened to this as an audiobook. Maybe I would have enjoyed that more. Maybe the different voices would have made more sense to me, but it's too late now. It's too late. I read it on my Kindle. This is also not your regular book. This is a novel written in verse, which I do usually really like. Most pages have no more than 15 lines on them, and yet it still took me weeks to finish this book, so figure that one out. But I think with the poetry style and the briefness of each chapter, I just really struggled to get to know any of the characters, which did feel like a real shame. And that was definitely my main gripe with this book. But as you go through, each story slowly gets darker and darker. You see the teenagers as they really begin to fall into this like pit, this spiral of despair. And it feels almost unbelievable that any group of teenagers would have so many issues. But I suppose the point of this book is all their stories eventually come together. Like, this is a group of teenagers who are from different parts of the country with very different problems, but they all end up in the same place. And it's kind of like, how did they do that? But Jesus, this book was heavy. Like, each character is on a trip to rock bottom, each character is spiraling, and it's dark. In Tricks, Ellen Hopkins covers stories of drug use, suicide, abuse, gambling, sex, teen sex work, or I suppose teen trafficking. I must admit, this book made me feel a lot of things, but maybe at some points too many things. It's vivid, it's graphic, and honestly, maybe I do understand why this story might rub some parents up the wrong way. But again, these stories are also true. They are the reality for many people out there. Perhaps this one is for a more mature teen to read, but this isn't a story about adults. This is a story about teenagers for teenagers. It gives voices to those marginalised, vulnerable teens, and it doesn't shy away from reality at any point. So it's up to you whether or not you want to give it a go. It was a hard read. And book number 6, the final book of this video, is Looking for Alaska by John Green. Now, this is a book which, in my opinion, has absolutely no business being on any banned books list. The ALA says this one has been challenged for being sexually explicit, but I could not for the life of me remember any sexually explicit scenes in this book. I did admittedly originally read this many years ago, so I did have to re-download it onto my Kindle just to flick through and find it, and honestly, I still don't get it. I don't get the sexual explicit scene. There is one chapter in the book involving oral sex, but I wouldn't really describe it as pornographic in nature. It's actually kind of used to contrast to a later, more emotionally significant kiss that happens in this book. So I don't get it. But according to some parents and school boards, this is very inappropriate for teenagers who famously never explore their sexuality. I also found some complaints online of cigarettes and alcohol, but again, they're teenagers. If you didn't spend your teenage years getting drunk in a field and learning important lessons, were you really a teenager? If you can't tell, this book is an inclusion on this list, which has truly, really baffled me. Anyway, this book is about Miles Halter, who is also known as Pudge to his friends. He's always lived a very safe, a very boring life. He's never been rebellious or experimented with anything. His whole life, as they say in a blurb, has been this one big non-event. But now, Pudge is off to boarding school and he swears to himself that he is going to go in search of the great perhaps. He's going to live life a bit more, essentially. I feel like this is a very universal experience. You reach a certain age, whatever that age is, and decide that you need to start living your life. When Pudge arrives at boarding school, he very quickly becomes enamoured with a girl down the hall, a girl called Alaska Young, and she is anything but boring. Pudge is soon pulled into Alaska's crazy, crazy world, and things very quickly spiral out of control. And then something huge happens. Now, if you've never read Looking for Alaska, this might be considered somewhat of a spoiler, but it's also kind of the entire basis of the book, so maybe not. And also, this book is 20 years old, so maybe it's not a spoiler. But Alaska suddenly dies in very ambiguous circumstances. Nobody is really sure if she took her own life or if it was just some form of tragic accident, and it sends all the characters into turmoil. As they try to make sense of what happened to Alaska, they try to answer these questions which are ultimately unanswerable. Nobody knows what happened, and sometimes that's just how life goes. Now, I adore John Green's writing. I know he does get a bit of flack online nowadays for his early YA novels, the whole manic pixie dream girl thing, but so many of his books were a very key part of my teenage years, of my own self-discovery. I read these books, especially Looking for Alaska, myself as a teenager, as a child, and I do think they raise such important questions in such delicate ways. Instead of shoving the answer at you, like with Alaska and her death, John Green so often prompts you as a reader to explore your own thoughts and feelings around something, around whatever's happening in the book, to come to your own conclusions. And I think that's a really powerful message in any YA or teenage book. The fact that this book is on any banned book list is just absolutely baffling to me. Like, because of one chapter which briefly talks about oral sex. Like, girl, teenagers are doing worse every time you turn your back. It's self-discovery. You gotta cut that umbilical cord at some point. And besides, if you've raised your kids right, if you've fostered trust in your children, you shouldn't need to worry about one chapter or one scene in a book unravelling all of that hard work, right? And in my mind, that's kind of what it all comes down to, I think. Like, parents, just talk to your damn kids. Just talk to them. So there we go, the top 6 most banned books in the USA as according to the ALA. I am very intrigued to see your thoughts and feelings in the comments section. Have you ever read any of these books yourselves? Do you agree or disagree with me? Do you think any of these books should be banned? And listen, you can disagree, but you've got to be polite about it, okay? Like, be nice. We can disagree, but still be nice. At the end of the day, I personally think censoring books just does more harm than good. Parents and school boards and politicians claim that censoring these things comes from a place of care, from a place of not wanting children to read about inappropriate things. But what about the children who are going through the inappropriate things? Like, do they not deserve to feel seen, to know what's happening to them is wrong, or that there's help around the corner? Books really can be lifelines. Like, they can give names to the unnameable, they can give language to pain. When we censor stories that deal with trauma or abuse or identity or whatever it is, I don't feel like we're protecting children at that point. Instead, we're kind of just abandoning them. For so many, books provide a worldview outside of their own, but equally for a lot of people, they provide representation. They provide them with their worldview. If we send the message that some experiences are too shameful to talk about or too taboo to be acknowledged, what does that tell the children who are going through these experiences? We don't want to think about it happening, but it really does. So I say, let kids read, let libraries do what they are designed to do, to be a resource so people can find something that talks to them. And we need to trust young people with complex stories. We're giving them a chance to think critically, to build their worldview. And at the end of the day, books aren't really the ones doing the harming. Like, I do acknowledge there is a line, like erotica shouldn't be in children's libraries. I know I will get some comments saying that, I have no doubt. But we're thinking critically here, okay? Critical thinking, good skill to have. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, let me know. If you want to see the rest of the books in the banned books list, then I will do that for you. Comment, subscribe, like this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.